Fighting Noise, a nonoise podcast.
Welcome to Fighting Noise, where we explore how innovation can help reduce noise and its impact on our lives. Once you start fighting noise, you realize something surprising. Very few people are truly working on this problem. But in almost every conversation I've had, people say, "Oh, I didn't know about that. I'll start caring more." That's what impact looks like. My guest today is part of the same fight. With his new book, I believe he'll make a real difference. I hope impact. Please welcome the American journalist Chris Berdik, author of Clamor, How Noise Took Over the World and How We Can Take It Back. Hello, Chris. Good morning.
Hello, Julien. Thanks for having me on.
I'm really glad to have you here today. So good morning to Boston, I think, or to East Coast anyway.
Boston, close
live
enough.
Here from Boston is close enough. Perfect. And here from live from Germany, from Europe. Chris, in Clamor, you show that noise is not just a loud annoyance. It's a public health crisis, a design failure, kind of, and a challenge for how we live together. So what was the turning point for you? When did you realize noise was much more than only a sound?
I think there were two major turning points. The first was when I wrote a piece for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine about a public health researcher at Harvard focused on noise. I had never really thought about noise as a widespread systemic pollution. I had thought about it as something that bothered me from time to time, certain sources that bothered other people, a more episodic, almost personal issue. Then I started to read the epidemiology that links noise with not just hearing problems, but with cardiovascular disease, with hypertension, stroke, that links noise with problems of mental health, dementia, depression, development issues with children. And this really struck me, the widespread impact of noise in public health from a source that people still argue about what it actually is. Some people maintain that it is sort of a social construct, that it doesn't exist in its own right. So that sparked my interest. Then the second revelation for me was once I had written a few articles about noise, different aspects of it, and I saw that it was worthy of a book exploration, that contract was signed just before COVID hit. So this was late 2019, early 2000, or early 2020. In subsequent to the pandemic, there were, of course, cities emptying out, and the skies were free of airplanes, and the streets free of cars, and nobody was gathering together. The sort of decibel levels where people were testing it were dropping 4 to 6 decibels or so, and there was this hush that descended, and I think people had mixed feelings about it. I certainly did. There's a joy in being able to hear birds again that you couldn't hear before in great numbers, to not have cars everywhere. I think people took some solace in that, but it really hit home to me that there's this quieter world, but there's context, how important context is to all of this sound and what it means to us. So that was the second piece of it, where I thought about what is our sonic goal if we fight noise? What are we aiming for? And how different that is depending on whether you're talking about a city park or a restaurant or your home office. That is kind of those two revelations really brought it home to me.
That's great. So we started directly in, and I have already a lot of questions for you listening to that. But maybe let's start with the first things first. Let's introduce yourself. Chris Berdik, who are you? I'll let you introduce yourself.
I am a journalist. Currently, I'm a freelance journalist. I write about scientific topics and education topics. I've been freelancing for more than a decade or so. I have a previous book under my belt called Mind Over Mind, The Surprising Power of Expectations. It's more or less about the placebo effect in both medical and non-medical areas. Prior to this decade of freelancing, I had worked on staff at magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and Mother Jones, which is an investigative journalism magazine. I had worked for several years covering science and the medical school for Boston University. So I have written for many different outlets. Typically, science really is where I spend most of my time because I have found it fits my personality. It rewards curiosity and it suits the sort of reporting that doesn't depend on breaking news and beating other people to the scoop of the day. It really is the adage used to be that these sorts of stories don't break, they ooze. And I am drawn to that kind of coverage, and I think my writing suits it as well.
I do confirm on the last one. You wrote another book and first book, but what first drew you to write this book about noise? What I spoke about impact in the introduction. What's your hope or your objective with that book?
Yeah, my objective with this book is to try to broaden this fight against noise. As I mentioned, the way I used to think about noise is the way I think a lot of people think about it. It is one noise problem and then another noise problem. Your noise problem is your noise problem. Mine is mine. People who are dealing with noise from traffic, if I'm not dealing with that noise from traffic, I don't think twice about it. I think there's generally been what I call a sonic short-sightedness, where people, let's say in architecture or in urban design or in product design, don't think about sound, certainly don't think about it first.
Mhm.
I'll skip ahead just to say, one story I was really taken with was these product designers at Philips, who are major creators of patient monitors in hospitals.
Mhm.
They decided a few years ago, 2018 or so, to take a look at and redesign the sounds that their alarms made on these patient monitors. Hospitals have a big problem with way too many alarms that all sound the same, many of which are false. And they heard a talk by a sound designer who was working on this issue and said, let's look at these sounds. These are products, these patient monitors that have undergone millions and millions of dollars of research and development over decades. And they found that the source of the sounds that these monitors still use was from a cassette tape from 1981. So I think that is, you know, a systemic issue where the choices that we're making, we are inviting sound into inviting noise into our lives. And if we were more aware of the impact of our sound environments to make our hospitals function better, to make our restaurants do the job that we want restaurants to do, which is to help us socialize with one another, for instance, to make schools better places for learning. If we thought about these things in a broader, proactive way, I think we would make some progress where just chasing down decibels after the fact is still necessary, but I think it's too narrow and too reactive.
In Europe, at least, but I think everywhere in the world, regulation is limiting sound by intensity, limiting a certain level of decibels. Mostly 80, 85 is the limit where sound is or noise is starting to really to hurt. Hearing device, the ear. But you say in your book that measuring noise with just decibels isn't enough. You even compare it, and I will quote you, blind men grasping different part of an elephant. So meaning we don't really understand what noise is. We are kind of blind in front of this. Why isn't loudness or intensity alone a good way to understand noise?
Well, it's because I'll say exactly why it does matter. Within the 3 centimeters of the human cochlea, decibels are
Mhm.
all that matters. The power of that sound, it doesn't matter whether you are listening to a sound you love or hate. If it is loud enough, if it has as much enough acoustic intensity, it will cause damage to your ear. Once you leave that 3 centimeter space, many other things start to come into play. So the timing of the noise, there is some attention to that even in normal regulations. Nighttime noise is more heavily regulated. But beyond just nighttime noise, does that noise ever stop? There's a big problem now, especially here in the States, where we're building data centers as fast as we can. And these data centers need to have constant air conditioning and air movement to keep the uh, servers from overheating. And
Mhm.
inside, this is super loud. You have to wear ear protection. But outside, it's not, the decibels are not anything to uh, be triggering a municipal noise code violation. They may be, in the 60, 65 decibel range, but they are low frequency and it's like a hum. It's sort of a thing that you feel in your chest, and
Yeah.
and the noise never stops. So these are aspects of sound that that are broader than just how intense it is, that matter quite a lot to our ability to ignore the sound or mask it some other way. Um, there's another I'll become one other piece of research, which is a researcher from Finland who was trying to deal with open office noise in his nation,
Mhm.
where because they love quiet so much, when the open noise problem started, many of the first approaches were to add sound absorption everywhere and to have tighter regulations for how many decibels the air conditioning and heating could be. And so by quieting the background, it actually made the problem of the distraction from the office noise worse. So we have many
That's
situations where,
that's the alpha log effect you mentioned as well in your book, where
yes, the half of, yes,
you realize other sounds in a way deeper perspective because the rest of the room is quiet.
yes, exactly. Because our brains are looking for patterns all the time, looking for information. And a half a log, which is just half a conversation when somebody's on the phone, is the ultimate lure for our attention. We are curious about that in an
Mhm.
automatic way. That if you're overhearing a conversation in a language you don't understand, or that's garbled enough to be distorted that you can't follow it, you will be able to ignore that much easier.
That's call it, or it's called psychoacoustics. That's the effect of sound or unwanted sound, which are sometimes way below the limit of 80 decibel. You mentioned the cochlea. It's very interesting because the cochlea is our kept or the receiver, but behind the brain is subjectively transforming that information, that signal, into another information, and we look for something. So it's really, really hard to appreciate. I need to ask you a question when I read your book and listen to you. Are you optimistic about our capacity as human beings with our brain and subjectivity to tackle the issue of noise?
I think I am optimistic. I think it really depends on what our goal is. I think we will never be free of noise. There's a tendency, I think, now that we all have noise canceling headphones and the
Mhm.
ability to filter out the people on social media that we don't want to hear and listen to, and all these ways of kind of cultivating our own sonic bubble, information bubble, what have you, to devalue our shared sonic spaces. I say I'm optimistic, but that's the piece of it that makes me pessimistic. That we have this capability to retreat and have these sort of sonic sanctuaries that as much as we struggle, people like myself and others who think noise is a big issue, to kind of make people care about it. Having people care about the common sonic spaces that we inhabit is a huge part of it. I think people are, however, increasingly able to connect these formerly disparate noise issues to one another, and not just to one another, but to bigger, I call them bigger just because they're more expansive issues. I'll take, for example, uh, the healthy buildings movement, which is
Mhm.
being led by a research center at Harvard to focus on, well, we had this big push to have buildings be more sustainable and greener, but we spend 90% of our time indoors, and we could make these indoor spaces be healthier, both by better ventilation and the water quality, and make sure there's no mold, et cetera, but also for having a healthy acoustic environment that isn't going to hurt ears or cause chronic stress. There's a rise of sensory ecology in the environmentalist movement.
Mhm.
Looking at how human noise, in addition to artificial light, is creating this sort of sensory smog that is degrading habitat. So creating these networks of connection, of caring that broadens what noise is, what we define the noise problem as. It's not just a sound problem. It's a problem connected to how we interact with the environment, how we design our buildings, the healthiness of those spaces. I think that bodes well for making progress in this area.
You mentioned different specifics. I want to dive deeper in, but no, it doesn't affect everyone equally. And you say that you mentioned healthy buildings, but why is it also a question of justice and of inequality? Because is it building? We don't live all in the same way. And if you look at low income population, for instance, they don't think about healthy buildings. They are not, don't have this possibility. As you speak about ANC and noise cancelling headphones, it's kind of the same. I mean, we both have very expensive devices on our head and we can't allow ourselves to buy it. But for the most population on the world, it's not something accessible. So maybe can you give us a few examples out of your research about these inequalities to understand how it matters in terms of justice?
Yes. So start with the research that I've seen, which is basically it's mostly U.S. based, looking at neighborhoods and cities that were what we would call redlined. This is a practice in the 80s and the 40s where an organization that guided investment in cities would grade different areas of the city in terms of the risk for investment, and they graded them to a large extent based on who was living there. If you had more recent immigrants or more people with brown and black skin, then you were graded worse. Like this is a riskier place to invest. And the worst grade these were graded, but they also have color coded maps. And the worst areas were red. So they call it redlining. This went on for decades, but it was eventually outlawed in the 60s. Nevertheless, that kind of lack of investment became cyclical, and you had these, concentrated areas of poverty, not just from redlining, but this is part of what triggered it. So there's been a lot of research now looking at, well, what happened to these places, all other things being equal, if they were redlined in the 30s and 40s because of their population. And they have much higher health issues and much higher levels of pollution exposure from air, water, you name it, and noise. These are noisier places, and the reason is pretty simple. They lacked investment. They needed to welcome whatever jobs or attention they could get from infrastructure. So they were the places of least resistance for a highway to come running through the middle of them, or the waste incinerator plant that was going to be sited somewhere. It would be sited there. So these are all sources of pollution that include noise, but not exclusively noise. Almost all of them have particulate matter or other pieces of pollution emanating from them. So, the research shows this, what they call the noise gap, is pretty prevalent across the United States. So I'll start with that, and then we can kind of talk about another piece of this, which is the vulnerability part, which you touched on.
Yeah.
I may be exposed to the same level of decibels outside from planes flying over my house or what have you as somebody living a mile away from me, but that person does not have the quality of housing that I have, does not have the ability to maybe access a green space, park or what have you, to take some refuge from that noise. They don't have air conditioning, so in the summertime they have to keep their windows open and that noise gets in more than it does into my house. More exposure and more vulnerability that comes into play.
And vulnerability in terms of health more generally, maybe as well, because you need to change that. And when we speak about vulnerable people, we did mention here, I don't know, did you, in your work, did you tackle this neurodiversity and neurodivergence and the way neurodivergent people are maybe more sensitive to specific noises? It's something we discussed in another episode where I interviewed Sarah Tinsel, which is she's an expert on neurodiversity at workplace, and it was very interesting discussion as well about that topic. Did you have an introduction to that topic too?
No, I
Is this some
didn't.
research or?
That was a thing that I did not get into, and as I subsequent to writing the book and seeing that issue crop up a lot from people who have autism or other neurodiversity considerations, people who have had brain trauma. It's a major issue. I haven't done the research. I didn't include it in the book, and I regret that. But I think now,
Clamor 2 for the second, for the.
yeah, for the next one, yeah. I mean, I will mention one thing that has sprung to mind. Here in the States, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, and that was focused on accommodating people with disabilities of every type. And you know that's why we have all the curb cuts in our sidewalks, and we have ramps that allow people in elevators to access train platforms, etc. When that was passed, the government commissioned a study of restaurant noise to see if they should have quiet areas to accommodate people who had hearing difficulties. And they decided not the evidence didn't support the need for that, because at the time, the peak noise levels they were finding were 68 decibels, which is within the range of normal conversation.
Yep.
That's different now. We'll talk about restaurant noise perhaps as we go along, but restaurants by and large, when they've been measured, are quite a bit louder than that, and quite a bit harder for diners who want to talk to each other over their meal.
It's a topic we discussed in the first episode, I guess, I think, from Fighting Noise with the founders of Silencio, a Web3 startup trying to map noise all over the world, thanks to a specific app, a very interesting app, and it's interesting to see the difference in the restaurants. In case at some point I hope we will be able to pick our restaurant according to the average level of noise. I say average level of noise. You mentioned the green spaces before, and I want to mention that as well. There are a few actions, and I want to speak about positive actions now, but I ask myself, having quiet spaces in the world, and you mentioned that as well, it's not everyday spaces. I mean, it's great to have a green space in your city, but I don't know your life. In my life, I don't have the daily opportunity to spend 1 hour or two in a quiet space of my city. My everyday life is going from home to work to or the school of the kids. So it's a lot about mobility noise, in fact. And I have the impression that we do have some regulations which are not low enough. And we have these quiet spaces, these parks, national parks or green spaces in cities where we think, okay, but there are quiet spaces, so people can't complain. What do you think about that? What can you tell us about that duality between both lives, the real life and the life regulation expected from us?
Well, so I am speaking about this living in the United States as I do, but knowing that Europe has had regulations on the books for more than a couple decades now for large cities to not just map their noise, typically from transportation, but to identify, if the city is large enough, areas that are quiet areas, as you mentioned. These quiet areas, by convention, are just defined by a certain decibel threshold. And so to qualify, usually it has to have an average below 55 decibels over, I think, a 24-hour stretch. What that means in practice is that many of these quiet areas, they're singled out for protection and become this, I don't know, a background of quiet preservation in cities. They are these hard to reach places, as you mentioned, deep inside some large park or on the outskirts of the city. And I spoke to a researcher named Antonella Radicchi, who took a hard look at these quiet areas and said, what is the purpose of them? Is it just, are these just ornamental quiet areas where we can point to them and say, look, we've kept noise at bay here in this nook of a giant park? Or are they meant to help, the most people possible find some sonic refuge from the noise in their daily lives? And if it's the latter, then we need to have them be more accessible. And she came up with this idea of everyday quiet areas And it was hinged on the fact that quiet is not necessarily just about the decibel threshold. I'll say just from my perspective, I was recently challenged to define how I think about quiet, and I think about it as kind of a space of uncluttered attention where my sensory and cognitive abilities are able to expand rather than be constantly batting away signals. And Antonella created this Hush City app where she crowdsourced everyday quiet areas. And she did a lot of it in Berlin, actually. That was where kind of her major research work was, where people went around and identified areas within easy walking distance that they found that quiet feeling. And many of them were, they were obviously in green spaces with, trees and some birds and some water, let's say, creating a background masking sound, but also places where people were, these places that people felt relaxed and at ease, desolate and silent. And so Berlin did take up her work and partnered with her and created at least an attempt to start identifying everyday quiet areas. I think there's still work being done to sort of say, well, if we're not going to define it by decibels, we need some rubric for how we will define it, and that is a challenge. But that is, I think about that work a lot. What we want from quiet. Why is it good for us? Is it just keeping the noise at bay like a noise wall, or does it have its own function for us? And I think it's the latter.
In the book, you mentioned as well is the initiative of having kind of a noise budget. I think it's an initiative used by national parks. Can you explain it? And behind the question is noise budget a solution which could be applied on way more than national parks in terms of regulation?
Okay, this is something that I know a small amount about. So I'll tell you what I know, which is it's an attempt by the National Park Service to balance and create an adaptive noise management for the parks. So for any of these national parks, you have this tension because you want people to come and enjoy these parks. You want them to value them and experience them. And some people experience them by coming in and just walking quietly and listening. Other people experience them because they want to go snowmobiling or tour the place by helicopter. And you know they have a choice. The managers and the regulators here. We could ban all of those activities and create these sort of natural museums of of wildness where you're only allowed to come and look at them and then go on your way. Or we can create them to be flexible so that we allow people to access and experience them in different ways, but we maintain a reasonable level of noise intrusions. And so what they've done is many times created a sort of a noise budget for any, let's say, operators of noise making things like snowmobiles or helicopters or whatever in the parks. They'll cap it at a certain amount of sound that they are allowed to create with their devices and encourage them to say, well, if you want to, for instance, rent out twice as many snowmobiles as you do now and grow your business, invest in quieter snowmobiles. That way you maintain,
because you don't extend your budget, your noise budget. So as a business has a limit of the noise budget you are applied to your
right.
activity.
It encourages innovation, and there's still dissension and argument, and people are, this is not, it's not pleasing everybody, but it is, I think, an attempt to be flexible and adaptive in how sound is managed beyond just sort of banning things or free for all. Beyond
But yeah,
I don't know how exactly it would work beyond a sort of a contained place where in national parks, the National Park Service has control. They could not license you to operate there if you violate there, um, and they're able to have 3 or 4 air tour companies or whatever operating in the parks, and so they're able to say, we know how many decibels are from you. And I don't know how it would work outside of that.
But I mean, in a city like, if you look at or listen at noise of a stadium, for example, a big stadium could have kind of the same noise budget, and having to find solutions to contain that noise because you have inhabitants around that place, and they know there is a stadium here. I mean, you can't know that. You know that before you move in. Still, at some point, it's happening because that's repetition, which is disturbing. As there is in this movie, and I forgot the name, I could put it in the comments. There's an American movie about noise pollution, and they mention a lot this military planes issue. There is a base very close to a city. I don't know if you've seen that movie. I think the founder of Ben and Jerry's invested a lot into that topic. It's really going to share the link with you if you didn't see that. They complain because these aircraft, these planes are very loud, and people say, yeah, but it's just 6 minutes per day, 6 minutes per day, so it's not a lot. But it's 6 minutes per day at a level which is, I don't know, maybe 120, 150 decibel. It's very noisy. That's a lot of low frequencies as well. So it's really disturbing. So
Right.
6 minutes at 150 decibel, you could say, okay, we have a certain amount of decibel, and what's the rest of the day? And I think if you apply this to stadiums, if you apply this to, I don't know, in Germany, you have a lot of outdoor swimming pools, for instance, doing a lot of noise for the rest of the city because you hear that. Even from schools, but if you apply it to factories for the blue workers working inside of this factory and saying regulation is not about no machine above 80 decibel, and not a question of just average, but also a question of you have a specific budget in total per day, per hour, per week, per month, I don't know, something to research.
Okay.
That could be a solution to support innovation and to support people to look for innovation as well,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is a bit beyond the current regulations we have. That was
Yes.
thought based on.
By the way, I remember the movie now. It was a documentary about
A
noise
documentary,
in
yeah.
Vermont, right? Okay, was it? Okay,
In Vermont,
yes.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah, no, I think that especially when you mentioned the stadiums, there was a big fight here in Boston about Fenway Park, which is the home of the Boston Red Sox, and the Red Sox have, I mean, over the season, it's 130 odd games that they play. They don't play them all in Fenway, of course. Half of them are there, but
Yeah.
it's still a lot of crowds coming in and noise from that stadium. And then the stadium, when the Red Sox aren't there, decided they wanted to host rock concerts. And, it's a pretty dense neighborhood there. And the question was, how many rock concerts should this stadium host over the course of the year? And I think having that kind of a noise budget, saying, okay, well, you've got X number of baseball games, your noise budget is, whatever it is, how many rock concerts can you fit under that cap, is worth approaching as kind of a management approach. I think with factories, it's interesting because I know that there is a lot of attention paid to the time that workers are exposed to the decibels, not just the ultimate level. So if you have a certain level, like 80 here in the States, 85 decibels, when that is averaged over an 8-hour workday, then
It's having. Yeah.
you have to have the protection and the hearing screenings. And then they say, well, if it's over 90 decibels or something like that,
It's far worse.
it's you can't, the time that you could be exposed to it without harming yourself is cut by, every 3 decibels. I think it's cut in half.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is that attention, but yeah, as a regulatory structure, I don't think that's how they do it.
Yeah, it's just a way to understand that, and to be able to be honest, 85 decibel is something for more than 8 hours. I measured that level mostly at conferences or fairs, big fairs. And you go at a fair, you speak with professionals on the booth, and you explain them, we have 85 decibel now. So if you stay here for 8 hours, it will harming your ear and your cochlea for forever because you can't repair that. And people say, but I'm here for 9 hours already since this morning, and I'm here for 2 more days. And that's where people really understand that we are not living in the right way, and we need to do something about that.
That's
But
right.
let's keep positive, and maybe to end that episode, I want to speak about innovation. Did you identify in your research work in all these years, because you told me you started to think about this book, to sign the book in 2018, so it's been at least 6 years, you 6-7 years, you really research, or you are aware about all this. Did you identify innovations which should have more visibility, more awareness, which could be great solutions in general, or about specific branches, specific problems of noise and noise
Yes.
pollution, or the consequences of noise pollution, like tinnitus and so on?
Well, there are pieces of innovation. I think I would defer to you. I obviously heard a lot about the noise cameras that are being put in place in many cities, particularly in Europe. I don't know how well they are doing. If anybody has actually studied some overall decibel decrease in certain areas of the city through their use, they seem to be solving a problem that has existed in enforcement for quite some time, which is how ephemeral and episodic these noises often are, and being able to have complaints trigger some kind of measurement that actually captures the noise problem has been a big problem. I know that in New York at NYU they had created these distributed sensors that would be backed by kind of a artificial intelligence brain that could identify one noise from another, so that you knew that, oh yeah, that is a
So why not?
jackhammer. Uh, and it would do the same thing that these noise cameras do for traffic noise. But when I looked into that, there's a huge gap between having a sensor in a lab that can distinguish noise A from noise B, from having a sensor that at scale can do the job of decreasing city noise. And that gap is immense. I talked to the people at NYU about how many sensors they have been deployed, and it was, a couple dozen, something like that. Yeah, these things are not quite ready for prime time. I think that they are very promising, but my sense of where things are with them is not to overhype them. I'll put it that way.
Uh-huh.
What I looked a lot at in my research were technologies that allowed the rest of us to harness and amplify our power as consumers, to show companies and services that we value our acoustic environment. The one that I talk a lot about is Soundprint. You may be aware of it. It was started by a person in New York who has hearing difficulties, and he was a single person at the time, trying to go on dates, and he couldn't find a restaurant that was quiet enough to actually converse with his dates, and he decided to create this app that allows people to it sort of acts as a guide to quiet restaurants, bars, retail, any sort of venue. You can go and take the sound measurement and contribute to the map in any city you're in. That I think brings it visibility as a thing that people care about. Because I think a lot of restaurant owners, they didn't care, or they didn't think that people cared enough about it to get beyond, the fact that they wanted to have this modern look and strip out all the sound absorption and crank up the music because we want excitement. But no, we actually also want to be able to talk to each other, and these apps are a way of sort of showing that. And the other thing that's in sort of innovation that I really looked at was, if we're going to go beyond the decibel in terms of being proactive and think about what our soundscapes can do for us, we need to have tools that allow architects and urban designers to work just as easily as they do with the decibel number. A lot of innovative work right now around city soundscapes and going beyond just counting decibels. It's these bespoke projects that are very particular to one small park in a city and how they approached it. And to scale it requires some kind of standardization in terms of how you understand a soundscape and
Yep.
how to measure it and how to reach a goal. So there's a group at University College London who are part of this international project called the Soundscape Indices Project, and they are doing a similar thing with AI where they kind of paired extensive sound measurements and photographic records of different types of places like parks or business corridors or any type of urban space with interviews of people experiencing those spaces, trying to kind of create
To measure the
a large
psychoacoustic
model.
side. Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
of kind of so that when people are trying to predict when they're doing urban projects what the soundscape will be like and how it will be received, they can just take a few metrics and just sort of plug them in and be able to work with that rather than just sort of leave it up to intuition.
To intuition and then to invest into rework since after they have built this and went to the end and they discovered that there is an issue and there is a problem they need to solve. And
Exactly.
rework is a lot of investment. I always say that's a mix between regulation, education as well, because I mean, we could do a lot in terms of just being more respectful and being aware about the noise we emit ourselves in different ways, and innovation. And for innovation, I like the positive way. So finding a positive soundscape, as you mentioned, is a very interesting way. I think if we do invest more, and that's why creating no noise, if we do invest more, bringing this innovation from the lab to bring it at scale is something possible with way more investment. It's just a question of where do we invest? And if you look outside right now, 2025, June 2025, we don't have a lack of investment. We just don't invest into this topic. So I guess we could accelerate this innovation, put it at scale with the right investment, and that's one of the goals I have. I could, and I think so. So you do. We could discuss that topic for hours, but as we still have not a noise budget, but a time budget today to respect. As a last question, what can individuals and institutions or businesses actually do to make soundscape healthier, in your opinion? What would be your one recommendation for the listeners that can have impact? You can have impact right now. I hope much more with your book. And ordering your book is the first we would recommend. But what would be the second step they can actually do?
I'll mention it again quickly, which is that ability to harness our power as consumers, not just to complain about noise after the fact, but to reward companies and services that show they value the sonic environment. I think that's really important. It's not idealistic, but I think it has power. That's one thing. I think and I hope that a lot of people will read the book and see that they actually have a pivotal role in the soundscapes where they work and live. The folks who at Philips who worked on that patient monitor, those folks have huge power to affect the
Mhm.
soundscape of hospitals. So the people that are, working in the restaurant business, actually, if they thought about how to design their restaurants, and there are these tools now to have sort of immersive audio of a planned space, they could solve the problem. It really, I think people have a lot more leverage than they think they do if they think about sound and they don't just think about the noise that's bothering them in that given moment.
That was Chris Berdik, author of Clamor, How Noise Took Over the World and How We Can Take It Back. It gives a lot of hope when I listen to you and when I read your book and even see the name of your book. We need to take it back. Thanks a lot, Chris, for your time today. The book was just released in late May, so you'll find the link in the comment of this episode to order the copy or to order the book or the ebook even, depending on your choice. But I hope a lot of listeners will take a lot of insight out of these books, out of this interview today. So I want to thank you personally for the time you took just after the release of your book. I can imagine you jump from one interview to the other, but it was really interesting to have you. I'll say here in Europe, because the most listeners are European, in France, Germany, UK, or whatever in Europe, and we can take a lot of good insights for this. I let you the last word of the interview, and on my on the behalf of all the listeners, thanks a lot for your time. Please, you made in this interview.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much for all your listeners' time as well. I think the hope here is that we can understand that we are not going to live in a noise-free world, but we can do so much to not just make the world sound less bad, but potentially better. And thank you again.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you, everyone.